Like threads of a complex tapestry, trauma and ADHD are often interwoven, each influencing the other in profound and unseen ways. This comes from a quote from Gabor Mate, and we are going to explore that complex intersection in depth today. So, welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I bring NSI into your psychedelic healing spaces so that you can safely download and hear the messages that come from your body. I'm also an educator at the Neuro-Somatic Intelligence coaching certification.
And I'm Elisabeth Christoph, your co-host, and I'm the founder of Brain-Based, an online platform where we work together in community to rehab the nervous system for trauma resolution, behavior change, and resilience. And I'm also the founder of the Neuro-Somatic Intelligence coaching certification. And today we are joined by one of our NSI practitioners, Mari Del Luna, and I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast, Mari. Welcome.
Hi, yes, thank you for having me here. I am Mari de Luna, and I'm a neurosomatic coach, and I also work in trauma resolution. I specifically enjoy working with neurodivergent folks, working through intimacy and relationships, and how to show up authentically and with agency.
Amazing. I'm so looking forward to exploring ADHD and ADD with you today and neurodivergence in general. Would you share with us how this topic became so important for you?
Yeah, so for me is it's very interesting in understanding how a neurotype can shape a person's identity, how they show up, their personality, and we so much attribute these traits to a personality and not understanding what is going on for that person's neurotype. So it has been just a life journey for me to understand my behaviors and my choices.
Amazing. Amazing. Yeah, I think that it makes such a big difference when we start to understand why we're experiencing some of these outputs and start to extrapolate the way that our nervous system functions and the outputs that we're experiencing from our identity. And I really want to just start by reframing ADHD a little bit for people from a more neurosomatic perspective, because traditionally ADHD is defined by these three major features of like lack of attention skills, lack of impulse control, and hyperactivity. And as I was preparing for this episode, I did start thinking a lot about how it's more nuanced than that. It's more individual. And from a neurosomatic perspective, ADHD really is this cluster of outputs that are the result of how our nervous system takes in information through our sensory systems, how our brain interprets and integrates that information. And the outputs are especially driven by limited fuel and activation and function of our prefrontal cortex that is responsible for planning and inhibition of the survival mind. And then that can be what manifests as the behaviors like avoiding certain tasks or being distracted or issues with time management, forgetting appointments, impulsivity, fidgeting. All of these things can be outputs of that way that we take in information and the way our brain interprets it. And no expression of neurodiversity is without its gifts. ADHD brains and nervous systems are often also really creative and innovative. They can have expert knowledge in their area of interest. So it's really just about understanding ourselves. How does my brain and my nervous system function? How can I work with my brain and my nervous system to protect my health and lower my stress and really shine in these areas where I naturally thrive when I'm expressed, and work with my nervous system to manage the things that I want change in, either for my well-being or my mental health or my physical health or my long-term goals. And all of that can come from that deeper understanding.
I was thinking about this a lot, the pillars of like ADHD and ADD, and I was reflecting on Divergent Mind by Janera Nuremberg, and you mentioned the idea of one of the hallmarks is being a lack of attention. And when I was reading Divergent Mind, she actually says that ADHD is not a deficit in attention, but rather a challenge of regulating it at will or on demand. And it's often having too much attention, just not at the socially accepted times and situations. And so, and then we talk about authenticity, and we really live in a world that does not celebrate diversity and authenticity. And so when you're not living in a system that celebrates your authenticity and your individuality, it's really hard to break that shell in yourself.
Yeah, that ability to channel an amount of attention onto a specific subject, as you said, Jennifer, on demand. When we experience just so much stimuli coming through the senses and not having a filter to how to process all that data. But in particular for ADHD, when it comes to having an area of interest, it's where we can see a gift here, because in relatively a short amount of time, we can become an expert on a topic. But the downside of this is that with ADHD comes the time blindness, and also with it can lead to burnout. But that is a really good distinction to make, that ADHD is not so much a lack of attention, but more there is so much stimulus, so much data coming through all of our senses. And because of that, the brain is structure, there's no filter to sort of channel the attention where we need it to go. So I think this is an important distinction to make, as we just understand how this works.
I think also too, Mari, you had mentioned some of the ways that like looking at it through the lens of NSI helped you to support your energy levels. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that when you're talking about that, the burnout cost, and then also the hyper focus in certain areas of interest.
Yeah, Elisabeth, I think, when it comes to managing, managing energy, it was an important concept to understand for me, because I would feel fatigue for a task that seemingly doesn't feel or seem that to be energy consuming, but for me to pay attention in a conversation that I'm not interested in, or it is something that it's just not my point of interest, would cause me to fatigue after the interaction. So it's important to know this, because through NSI, I learned, okay, there are tools that I can use to stay present and to help me stay focused. Because I understood the distractions that were happening before was an attempt to regulate myself. But it misfired at the end, because I wasn't channeling my attention onto the task at hand. So there was a conflict in my system wanting to discharge too much stimulus and retain some.
That is really resonant. Um, so, one of the things also that we're exploring this season is sensory inputs are taken in and interpreted differently from person to person in the way that they affect us. Even if it's the same input, right? Like we're all taking in an input right now from each other, and that's all being interpreted very differently from our into our nervous systems, just like you, our listener. And so we think about like how loud sounds are, or the way a touch feels, or the way that the light feels to our visual systems. And that heightened sensitivity, it can lead to diminished capacity for fuel for the prefrontal cortex, and it can cause constant stress and dysregulation that can lead to moving through the world from more of the survival brain than more from the survival brain and from limbic responses without inhibition capabilities of the frontal lobe, because the system is taxed. And we know it's one of the jobs of the prefrontal cortex to inhibit the back brain and all of the noise. But if the wiring isn't there for somebody, then it's just going to take a little bit more tools and a different level of work to just highlight and turn those parts of the brain on. But that constant stress and dysregulation of moving through this world in a quote different brain, it leads to self-soothing behaviors. And you see that a lot with ADD and ADHD. There's a link to eating disorders and substance abuse because of that constant need for regulation and relief. And that's something that's so relatable for me when I reflect on the binging narratives that I had, and whether that was food or alcohol that kept me regulated in a lot of times a social relational experience. We know even with genetic variation, genes carry potentials inherent in cells of any individual. Which of multiple potentials are expressed in the cell is a question of circumstances, environments, attachment needs, and stress. And we know that that is all unique to an individual developing in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, development, there's always this genetic component. And so I really want us to dive into the how complex trauma affects that. Developmental trauma, we know it impacts executive function and our brain's ability to integrate information, to recall memory, to make sense of the internal signals in our body with accuracy, with clarity, regulation of our HPA axis and our stress response. And so for individuals with ADHD, the thalamus does function differently. It impacts our attention, sensory processing, our behavior. And then when we have that dysregulation of the thalamus that can come from developmental experiences or biodiversity, that can lead to challenges in sensory integration. Maybe we're taking in an overwhelming amount of stimulus. And we're reacting differently to that stimulus, creating different responses in the body. So it's harder for someone with ADHD to process and respond appropriately to sensory information. And so maintaining like selective attention, focusing on important information while ignoring distractions can be really hard. And that also impacts to our levels of alertness and our arousal, our F responses that get turned on when there's all of that overstimulus. And then we also have our threat response, our adrenaline and our cortisol that pushes us away from things into fight and flight. And so when we start to have changes in that regulation from how our thalamus is functioning, it really makes a big impact on like what I'm able to feel pushed toward and what is overwhelming and creates that threat response. And it's also really important to remember that these things can be trained. With intentional stimulus, we can start to work with our thalamus to help it have a different reaction to sensory stimulus, to have different discernment in what is important, and then to create new reactions in the nervous system, more regulation with that stimulus.
What I would like to add is bringing inhibition tools is bringing a sense of containment, a sense of containment is for me is needed so that I'm able to focus on a given set of stimulus, right? If we think about how the brain is working and not able to filter in so many data, so much information that comes through the senses, and bring in a tool that can serve as a containment for us. So for example, I'm wearing a belt at this time, and what that does for me, it helps me bring containment to my ideas. As crazy as that might sound for some, it is how my body is using the tool. It's helping me ground my feet onto the floor. It's helping me feel my butt against the chair, my back against the chair. So the app belt is doing this for me. Is sort of regulating the amount of information that is coming at this time. So I think most people think that in order to regulate that, you may need to shut completely, like to shut out completely everything, to shut down, or like to reduce the amount of information and data and stimulus that are coming in a given time. And knowing that certain tools are there to support us to stay focused and grounded is something that, in my opinion, we should all know and understand so that we can stay present and regulated.
I'm also wearing an ab belt, Mari, and I love that you brought this up. It's one of my favorite passive tools to work with because we're working with the interoceptive system. So inside our bodies are getting, our organs are getting so much stimulus, and then that is feeding directly up into the insular cortex. And it's like, by wearing our ab belts, I really love what you said about like grounding us in here right now, because that is what it's doing. Because through using the ab belt, we are trying to change the predictive response that's happening in the insular cortex about having this big conversation and what it means to show up here together and to be talking, to all these people on such a broad stage. And it's been the ab belt is a tool that I often use. When I am on the podcast. And, sensitivity, like just a few minutes ago, we were talking about like this is a core human trait that's often not honored as one of our gifts. And part of the gift is the way that we express emotionally. And emotional regulation is really difficult for someone who has a neurodivergence. And it really adds the emotional overwhelm. It really adds to the sensory overwhelm that one would experience in a situation, because not only is the body being affected by all of this stimulus, but of course our emotional body and our limbic system is going to be affected by this. And there is a lot about emotional regulation to explore when we're talking about the thalamus and the cerebellum. The thalamus is involved in the processing of emotional information, and dysregulation in the thalamic pathways can contribute to the emotional dysregulation that's often observed in ADHD, leading to intense emotional reactions and mood swings. Relatable. This is why inhibition tools, especially initially, are so important as a resource to the nervous system. It helps to prevent overwhelm and also helps manage the emotional dysregulation that is the result of sensory overload. Another tool that I use a lot is my sleep mask. I a lot of times will give my eyes a visual rest and just take either using my blue glasses, which is one of my passive tools, or the just total blackout so that my eyes can have a rest throughout the day, whether I'm, on the screen a lot, or maybe it's just a day where I wake up, I'm activated, and it's like, boom, your eyes are on. Every time your eyes are open, they're processing. And so, how often can I give my visual system a break throughout the day? And that really impacts the way that I show up throughout the day. It kind of keeps me going by giving them that rest and just taking all of the light and all of the stimulus away. And, you know, talked about the emotional regulation showing up as mood swings. It can also show up as frustration. Easily becoming frustrated is a hallmark for anyone experiencing ADHD and ADD symptom, ADD and ADHD outputs. And we can often experience that over what seems like really minor issues. And I think that like this sensitivity that we experience, this high sensitivity, also comes to the way people could criticize or judge us. And it often feels like rejection. It's perceived rejection. And we don't always want that. And it can be misdiagnosed as other mental conditions. And it's really the result of a sensory overwhelm that gets misdiagnosed or overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the inhibition tools that you guys talked about are so huge in working with the system so that it has more capacity and can stay grounded and present. And then I'm really glad you brought up the cerebellum, Jen, because I think this is not talked about that much. And it's something that Mari and I have been talking about quite a bit as we've been going through different NSI trainings and watching her outputs and how the nervous system responds to some cerebellum training. And it's a really key player here that we want to look at. So it's part of our brain that's located at the base of the skull. And it's really responsible for coordinating voluntary movements, maintaining balance and posture, or fine tuning our motor actions. So when we think of the cerebellum, it's like accuracy, balance, and coordination of movement. But it also has a really big role in emotional regulation. It's this big integration hub. So many neuronal connections happen in our cerebellum, even though it's just this small part of our brain and overall size. More than half of the neurons, the cells that make up our nervous system, are located in the cerebellum. And it takes all of this sensory information, like other parts of the brain that we've talked about here, thalamus, insular cortex, and it integrates that information with motor actions. So it's really important for like smooth, coordinated movement. And at the same time, that's also integrating our sensory inputs with our emotional responses, with the movement and the mobilization of our body to express emotions, and really helping us modulate how we react to different emotional stimuli and coordinating the physical responses that come from that: muscle tension, diaphragm mobilization, vocal tone. And okay. So our cerebellum really contributes to the context in which our emotions are experienced and then expressed. It helps our brain understand and predict emotional outcomes based on sensory inputs and past experiences. And it has a relationship to our frontal lobe and to our impulse control. And that pathway is really important, again, between the deep intrinsic muscles, the mobilization of emotional experience, and then our ability to regulate and interpret with emotions.
Yes, that is true. And looking at the drills the NSI has taught me, they are not difficult in execution. There are seemingly simple tasks, but when we understand how these brain structures may affect the way we are showing up, and when we are retraining, rewiring, um, we may seem like some outputs that are uncomfortable. In my situation, I experienced some frustration with doing non-linear complex movements to stimulate my cerebellum. And I found that really interesting because, as Elisabeth just said, this is the part of the brain involved in emotional regulation. So the good news is that through these drills, intentionally training these parts of my brain, I've observed in very short time my reaction to perceived mistakes. So I consider myself a person who has been rigid in the way when I perform a task and I see the result, it may not match my expectation. And through this rehabilitation, practicing NSI drills, I can see my reaction, which is more flexible. There is more compassion, and there is more perspective in how I execute, how I perform. And it's great because this is what I like to tell people that work with me, that is through this daily intentional training that we're able to rewire our responses to situations that are stressful. And so, yes, I have this lived experience that with a seemingly simple drill has a huge, huge impact in the way I respond to stressful situations. So I am so glad that we're having this conversation and sort of breaking it down for people to see that it is possible, and the results are possible also in shorter amount of time.
I think you just said three really key words here, Mari: flexibility, perception, and compassion. And those are three really big ideas that NSI really helps us with. And another interesting system that we work with, it's the proprioceptive system for joints. It's the mechanoreceptors in our joints where it helps with our body mapping. So proprioceptive training, it also drives fuel and activation to the prefrontal cortex, which is important for the executive function that we're looking for: paying attention to tasks, maintaining focus, inhibiting impulses. And these areas of the brain that are close to one another, they impact one another. So if you can get more fuel and activation to the motor cortex, resourcing it better. It has more glucose and oxygen, which is how the brain fuels itself. And this is one of the reasons that before I do a task that needs attention and focus, I'll do some proprioceptive training: complex, intentional, precise, nonlinear movements through my joints. And also, when we train our proprioceptive systems, we're clearing up our body map and giving our brains a more accurate picture of where we are in space. This is important for reducing a daily stress load. The clearer and more accurate my body map is less threat to my brain as it is moving through the world, because it makes accurate predictions to keep me safe. Then I experience less protective outputs like an F response or emotional reactivity and potentially burnout as I move through my day and my world.
Yeah. And, really, it's huge to have that prefrontal cortex fuel and activation, because this is a really important component of the brain for ADHD too, right? This is where we plan, we organize tasks, we inhibit our back brain responses. And ADHD does involve disruptions in the pathways that connect the prefrontal cortex to deeper brain structures. And those pathways, like for motor control and decision making and regulation of our emotions, are really important. And the more myelinated we can get those, the better they're functioning, the less we experience some of these outputs that we don't want. And we've talked in here quite a bit about how complex trauma and developmental trauma impact our executive function and our frontal lobe. So I think it's really important to know that we can start to do intentional things to make change in that area.
If your brain is developing under a chronic stress load, and everybody's brain is different, then we can't expect everyone to have this same neurotypical higher order systems of thinking and this demand of like the prefrontal cortex. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Mari, about complex trauma and brain development and this lack of executive functioning as you see it.
Yeah, Jen, I think this conversation is super nuanced, but it's beautiful to start unfolding like so many layers. The way I understand it is that a person who develops in an environment that is chaotic, right? And it may not be just the environment that is chaotic, but the small individual, the child may lack the attunement from the caregivers, and that is overwhelming to the child. As an infant, the children, they need to be to have their needs met by their primary caregivers, and so if those needs go unmet, this can be overwhelming to the child. So from that perspective, it's good news that we're having these conversations and that NSI exists, because then we're not sentenced to live a life that we can change our destiny. We can change with resources. We can change the way we show up and the way we are going about our lives, despite the development and despite the chaotic environment that we grew up in. So, coming back to CPTS and ADHD, how can a person who develops with, under these circumstances, have the focus and attention that is needed to survive in today's society, right? But thankfully, we now know that we can change this with intentional training, with neuroplasticity, with giving ourselves the intentional stimulus and practice to regulate our nervous system and to show up the way we want to show up in life.
Yeah, I think, Mari, what you just brought up is really important. The attunement and attachment that we experience as we're developing and how this impacts our brain function and our nervous system development, and really all of season 3. We looked at the role of attachment and development and how we are relational beings. And there's no way to look at complex trauma and separate that from the impact on our ability to feel safe and connected in relationship to other human beings. And that at its very heart, CPTS is an attachment wound. And so, like, if that's not resonating for people, make sure you go back and listen to some of those episodes, because we really lay it out there. But one of the really important things to start to examine is that as children, as infants, our brain circuits are really influenced by our primary caregivers. Most of the research is looking at the biological mother, but you could substitute in there any primary caregiver in general and their emotional states. And Gabor Mate does a lot of work on this, looking at how ADD originates in the stress affecting the primary caregiver and the emotional interactions with the infant because of attachment and attunement. Like, we're not communicating verbally. All of that communication is nonverbal. It's vocal tone, it's body language, it's eye movements, it's the ability to hold a gaze, all of these subconscious signals that reflect the primary caregiver's internal emotional state. So an infant's communication is really purely emotional. And then the things that are disrupting a primary caregiver's emotional security are also disrupting the neurobiological wiring, the chemical supplies of that infant brain, and how it's going to respond, the HPA axis, how the limbic system responds. And so no wonder, though, that then now my brain develops a little bit differently and shows some of these heightened sensitivities to sensory processing, differences in executive function, because that's the water I was swimming in during development, responding to her emotional states.
Attunement is something that we've talked about so much on this podcast, and really misattunement is what you're talking about in your experience. And so what we really mean here by attunement is being able to read and interpret accurately the signals that are coming from not just our primaries, but in this example of development, from our primaries, from their facial expressions, their social cues, their posture, and their vocal tone. Like, am I able to really read that and hear what they're actually saying to me? And it's this, when we have attunement, there's this freedom from a lens of threat that distorts and interrupts that continuity of consciousness, that dissociation will bring about, and particularly in a relational aspect. And that lack of attunement, it can really thrust us into some other consciousness, if you will, throughout our development. And this other felt sense of experiences from my past, and not being able to accurately hear these signals from what other people are saying and expressing, so that I can really hear them. And then also in attunement, we also want to be able to internally attune and regulate ourselves to the environment that we're in. So this is where presence comes into play into our conversation, presence and embodiment, because presence is going to give us the ability to have more awareness and to hear accurately what other people are saying and preventing the misinterpretation of signals from the environment or emotional signals because of the ongoing narrative that can distort the reality of seeing things clearly. And so with presence, I could be in any environment and interact with it, with people as they are and with the situation as it is. And through NSI, that means that I'm experiencing from a place of safety. And then that safety is going to allow an attunement coming from the inside out that's also coming from the outside in.
Well, I would like to add that interoception, and I think it's key. It's a key area. When I started understanding from an NSI perspective how interoception works, I made the link about attunement, right? And so attunement or self-attunement refers to tuning to one's needs. And so interoception plays a key role here because it refers to those signals that are coming from our internal landscape, our organs, and our ability to sense what's going on, whether we're hungry, whether we're hot, or and so on and so forth. So having the ability or the skill to attune to what's happening inside of us and then having an accurate interpretation of that has to do with us understanding how interoception works, and we can train this system to not only perceive and become aware of what's happening but also interpret those signals more accurately. And so I make the link with what happens with ADHD, right? Like, so understanding the cues that are happening inside and then adapting real time and adjust in real time so that we don't experience undesired outcomes or undesired behaviors. So yeah, I think it's really interesting and worth the time and understanding how those various systems work and interact with our nervous system, and bringing tools that can help us in not only interfering in real time but also over time we can create prediction, and so that it's a reflection of undesired or impulsive behaviors, which I think we will be touching on later on in this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking about ADHD and burnout and how there's so many reasons why when we have these differences in the way we take in information, it can really lead us to burnout. And one of the things that you just talked about, Mari, was like, I don't have good, clear signals coming from inside, so I can't read what's happening and maybe interpret too much threat to that. But also, I don't know what my real capacity is. I don't know how to put up those boundaries. And then at the same time, because of whatever reason, whether it's biodiversity or complex trauma, I have this heightened sensitivity to sensory stimulus that's exhausting my system all of the time. And then there's all the other things that we've been talking about with different types of neurodivergence, masking and trying to fit into these molds, living in a world that isn't really patterned for us. And when you have all of this coming together, this heightened sensitivity, the increased stress load, the interoceptive deficits, just all of it coming together, it's really easy to lead to a place where you are exhausted, where you don't have enough fuel to keep going, and find yourself in these periods of burnout and depletion.
Yes, Elizabeth, the burnout portion of this is so important because as we were talking before, the overwhelm comes from the variety of information, all the data that is coming through the senses, and us not having the ability to concentrate or to channel that focus and attention and to process, like one of the early lessons in NSI, one of the early drills that I learned from NSI was the infinity walks. And this is a drill where we are integrating data from the different systems. And that drill in and of itself can be used, or I use it to discharge or so when I think about data integration and how this drill works, it to me, I get the picture that my brain is sort of using the data that it wants and integrates it and consolidating some memories and then discarding those pieces of data that they're not interesting to me. And so, when burnout, to me, it sounds, or it happens when we don't have outlets to let go of that pent up energy or the pent up stress. So yeah, going back to all the drills that NSI teaches us, those some drills are designed to help us integrate the data, and some drills are designed to help us offload and just rest rest and digest the energy, rest and digest from the data, from all the information that we've been getting all day long.
So many important things there. Being able to de-stress and discharge, having our nervous system be able to come down and re-regulate. And we talked in the depression and the chronic fatigue episode about dopamine, and ADHD is associated with dysregulation in the dopamine pathway. And that really plays a critical role in motivation and reward and processing and cognitive control. And how our nervous system is functioning really has a big impact on our dopamine responses. And if we have impairments or issues with our dopamine signaling, then that really limits our ability to pay attention. But it can also start to drive reward seeking in different behaviors, right? So we can really move into this world of addiction, substance addiction, disordered eating, because not only are we starting to use these tools to get chemical changes in our brain, dopamine, reward, but also for self-regulation, right? When we have a nervous system that's overtaxed, that we don't have the ability to come down and rest and digest and repair, we can use substance to as a quote unquote maladaptive coping behavior to start to curb that constant high stress sympathetic state. And so I think there's just so many important overlaps to look at. And I know that you work, Mari, a lot with addiction and have had some of your own experiences with that and the overlaps with ADHD. So I'd love to just hear about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, talking about addiction, and I'm very grateful for the reframe from NSI of addiction, that it is an output. And so, when we look at a behavior output like addiction through that lens, it brings so much compassion already um, to the topic. And because there's so much shame associated with addiction, right? There is also in addiction recovery these expectation that comes from willpower. And it was really interesting to hear NSI, reframe that willpower has nothing to do with our behavior. So understanding that our behavior is truly an output of our internal systems and how our internal systems are dealing with all the external data that comes in through the senses. So, yeah, so understanding that addiction may come from the need to satisfy um, something. There is a drive to either satisfy a need, and this, could be because when we talk about anything that is overwhelming to the system, it could be something that is too much, too fast, too soon, or not enough. And so, again, when we think about addiction, it's just our desperate need to soothe a need.
I'm one of those individuals who experiences high substance use throughout my life, as I've moved through my world. And we talk about this idea of the nervous system bucket and the capacity in it, and I can look at the substances that I've used over time and in the way that I've used them to see how I'm overwhelmed in this sensory experience. And I think a lot of individuals with ADHD would use substances as a form of self medication to alleviate symptoms such as inattention, hyperactivity, or emotional dysregulation. And this can increase the risk of developing substance use disorders or behavioral addictions. And like, for instance, when I was online dating several years ago, I would have to be at home. I would either smoke some cannabis or have a drink before I went on the date. So I was already like, okay, I've got this blanketed nervous system. I would use it in these situations to cope, but then it stopped having any boundaries. There were no boundaries. Or using food to cope as well. It would be nothing for me to leave any scenario and eat on the back end to re-regulate and to come down from an experience. And like, food is so inherently safe for our nervous system, and it really creates some competing narratives that go on in our brain, and then that those loops are also super energy costly. And so for individuals that may seek out substances or behaviors that provide the immediate gratification or relief from symptoms associated with neurodivergence, it creates a dysregulation in the dopamine system. I think in our rewiring through NSI, we start to learn, like, oh, there are ways that I can provide a relief for myself where I'm actually being rewarded, and it has nothing to do with substances at all. And to be able to lower the impulsivity, to lower these risk factors, and to have these empowering tools is it's so eye-opening, and it is empowering. I know I just want to say that word so many times, because the tools allow me to act not without thinking of the consequences, but thinking of the consequences, changing the prediction of what I could be possibly experiencing. And not considering consequences is going to add to the continuation of substance use or maladaptive behaviors. And the substance, and in substance, I want to include food in that.
Part of addiction that I wanted to share, as you mentioned, Jennifer, socially drinking. And it's so acceptable. If you think about drinking in social settings, it is one of the most acceptable things to do. As a matter of fact, if you're not a drinker, it's 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 looked upon different. So yes, I mean, for me in particular, I would use alcohol as a crutch, as the way, this is the only way I can show up socially. And slowly but surely, there was a dependence that developed over time, to the point where I couldn't function with or without it. The substance just took over, and we all know that it has consequences, physiological and emotional consequences. So it's so important now, to when I understand that I need to be giving myself a different set of stimulus so that I can stay grounded in social interactions. That has changed so much. And again, building that predictability. So I now, my system understands that without the substance, we're okay before and after the interaction, that the substance is not needed. And even though we understand that cognitively, it is different to experience it in the system at different levels. Because I also understand that over time, that predictability is what is instinctual. So for me, it's easier for me to say no to an alcoholic drink than it was before, because my system understands that it is okay to be without the substance before and after those interactions.
It's really incredible. And so, I mean, here we are. We're all three people who have experienced times of substance abuse, disordered eating. And it really is like, it's kind of incredible to sit here as people who now know how to work with our nervous systems, how to process emotions, and the real change that that makes in moving through the world. We've touched on so many different things, and there is a huge societal component of this too, right? Like we live in a very overstimulating society where a lot of people are developing with screens and social media. There's just this rapid pace and constant stimulation. And a lot of times, I think for especially kiddos that are growing up in this world, ADHD is it's not a disorder. It's really a adaptive response to the world that they're living in, to the demands that are being placed on that brain and that nervous system as it's developing.
I really do hope that people feel hopeful in listening to this conversation and understanding that there are better ways to cope with these sensory overloads. We don't have to harm ourselves or abuse ourselves really with these substances that make it maybe easier to get through a situation, but it's only easier in the moment, right? We deal with so much pushback from the nervous system as it tries to re-regulate and come back down from all of this overload and all of this overwhelm. And, we say that neuroplasticity is the science of hope on this podcast, because through neuroplasticity, we can change, we can make changes. And you've heard us mention several tools here that we use and that help to support some of the sensory overload. And we've not taught them to you. We do believe in the N equals one. The N equals one nervous system, in nervous systems, N equals one. And so we don't share tools on this podcast because we don't know how they would affect you. And so that is why we offer multiple resources, a free resource at rewirecourse.com. And then you can, of course, come get tools with us and train your nervous system intentionally daily by joining our membership site. And you get 2 free weeks at rewiretrial.com. And so, Mari, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today, for sharing your experience with complex trauma, NSI, ADHD, and how you work with your clients. And we'll have the links in our show notes for how people can reach you.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me on the podcast and for helping me bring the message far and wide. Thank you.
Thank you both for this conversation, being so open and vulnerable about your own experiences